Well, Ciaran and Dorota, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to have a conversation and to celebrate your winning the strategy and general management category in this year's awards with your case, Ryanair flying too close to the sun. I thought I'd start by asking, what is the case about?
So the case looks at the business model evolution of Ryanair since its inception in the mid-1980s through to 2017. And so the case was really motivated by a gap in the marketplace when it came to business model innovation and evolution. Dorota and I had been looking for cases for years that dealt with this topic and that provided a local example that our students could relate to. And Ryanair is a company that everybody relates to, anybody who has experienced Ryanair or read about Ryanair. And so what the case does is it starts in the early days. It talks first about the search for a business model, how the then chairman of Ryanair, David Bonderman, sent Michael O'Leary over to Dallas to meet Herb Kelleher, the late founder of Southwest Airlines, and how O'Leary was transfixed by the model. He stood on the runway looking at how quickly they turned the planes around, and he came back to Dublin knowing that that was the model that Ryanair was going to pursue. And so the early stages of the case talks about that early search for the business model. It looks at the economics and the evolution of the airline and aviation industry in Europe, how it's a very dog-eat-dog industry, very, very unfavorable economics. Yet despite this, Ryanair, because of its efficient business model, because of the policy choices that it has made, has just, performed admirably. And prior to up until the pandemic, continued to do so. And so that was the background. We then look at the changes that Ryanair needed to make, starting around, I think, Dorota, 2013. And 2013 was a pivot point for Ryanair because it discovered that about 70 million customers were choosing to pay a small amount more to fly with other airlines because they offered a more humane service. And they didn't treat them like cattle on an airplane. And so that was the instigation of what was known as the Always Getting Better program. And the Always Getting Better program, there were two major imperatives. One was to fix the pain points so as to get those customers coming back, where they would come back to Ryanair and they would have a higher service level. The second major thrust was to introduce a series of digital initiatives that would represent a major growth strategy. What Ryanair did around 2015 was it realized that because it had such a large installed base, it had at the time probably about 40 million registered users on its platform, on its website. It recognized that it could sell those customers not only airline tickets, but a bunch of other services. So it had long been involved in car hire. And so it really ramped up its car hire. It also introduced an initiative which has had mixed success called Ryanair Rooms, where customers could book their hotel accommodation. It has even gone into selling, if you go to London, theatre tickets and a range of other services. The other part of that is selling seats on other airlines. So it did a bunch of partnerships where it would feed flights in from different parts of the world, and Ryanair would then channel those flights into Europe. And that served as a major growth initiative. And all of these digital initiatives are housed in what's known as Ryanair Labs, a kind of a research and development laboratory or a startup within an airline where they're focused on the website, but they're also focused on these digital initiatives. And this latter strategy, which is profiled in detail in the case, is known as becoming the Amazon of travel, where it leverages that large installed base in order to serve all customers' travel needs. And that's where the strategy kind of was at prior to the major crisis that it encountered in 2017. And everything had been going swimmingly. It had been growing its revenues, its profits had been growing, its load factor was very, very high. Everything was going really, really well. And it suffered what would have seemed like a minor technical glitch in that it had a rostering crisis. And usually Ryanair has to schedule its pilots from, I think, April 1st to March 31st, their leave over that particular year. But in 2017, they had to shift to a calendar year. And so they had to basically schedule 7 months of leave in about 4 months. And that meant that they didn't have enough reserve crew in order to manage handover, and its punctuality suffered. And so it made the decision to cancel a bunch of flights. Ryanair, or Michael O'Leary, appeared, on various press conferences explaining to customers why they had canceled so many flights. And that was a critical point in the airline's evolution, because now the unions and the staff had the upper hand. And they used that in order to mobilize during the autumn of 2017. They started forming different groups, not only in Dublin, but across the European Union. And that led to the decision in December 2017, where Ryanair recognized unions for the first time in its history. And so what the case illustrates is how a great strategy that was doing swimmingly can be undermined by the neglect of human capital. And that was the one thing that Ryanair had not paid attention to. It was the one chink in its armory. And as soon as it got into difficulty with the rostering crisis, that provided the opportunity for the staff in order to mobilize and build up an offensive move. And the rest is history. Ryanair became unionized, added about 100 million to its cost base. It spent most of 2018, negotiating with different unions in different countries. It all had to be done separately. And it was a very tumultuous time.
And perhaps what I might add is just a little bit about Michael O'Leary himself, because I think the persona of the CEO has been quite interesting to include in that case study, even if only for illustrative purposes and to strengthen some of the points that we're trying to showcase, and also to make the case fun to read. And that's some of the feedback we were getting from our students, that it's just a joyous case to read. Michael O'Leary has been very consistent in how he led the airline to implement that business model. It's a ruthlessly implemented business model, except for those cracks around human capital, which Ciaran has just mentioned. But he was actually at a point in time even more involved than just as the CEO. He would have been the person behind some of the publicity stunts with the idea of, let's talk about Ryanair, whether it's a good thing that we talk about them in a positive light or in a negative light, that doesn't really matter. It matters that there's actually a lot of talk about Ryanair being out there in the media, increasing the visibility, basically free publicity for the company. So oftentimes it would have been even controversial what Michael already might have said, but it was creating that publicity for the airline and consistent with the low-cost business model, cheap publicity.
I think it's fantastic that you started your answer by saying that you spotted a gap in the market, that actually what led you to write this case was that you couldn't find a case that you wanted to teach yourself in this area, so you decided to write your own. And that's the motivation for many great cases. Could you share a bit about the writing process? So one thing that really interests me is you mentioned before we started this conversation that you decided to adopt a modular approach to the case. Could you say a little bit about what that's involved and why you chose to adopt that approach?
Essentially, as we've mentioned already, there was that gap in the market that we couldn't really fill with existing cases, in the sense that when we wanted to teach about business model innovation, and in particular the later aspect, which is a digital transformation of an incumbent of an existing company to a platform type of business, we just couldn't find a case like that. But then when you think about, in the case of strategy, about the entire process, starting from external, internal analysis through more minute details of how a strategy is being designed and implemented, there are a range of steps that you would like to follow with that case study. So we looked at each of those stages and we considered, what is it that, if you were to analyze from a strategy perspective, Ryanair's business model and trace that evolution over time, what would be the different types of analysis that would need to be carried out? And we took that approach step by step, creating chunks of content within the case study and the associated teaching note. And that creates the opportunity for us and for other case facilitators to maybe pick and choose. If there is a particular framework that someone needs to illustrate or get their students to work with, there is plenty of data in the case to do that. And I think that's one of the beauties of Ryanair as a company as well, that we could actually find ways of using multiple different frameworks with this case. That makes this case quite versatile. That makes it quite applicable and modular in that sense as well. Now, it's a fairly rich case. So we actually had a lot of secondary data that we used, we collected and used for writing that case. They were newspaper articles. We had plenty of interviews with the executives, in particular with Michael O'Reilly, but not only, that were available in the public domain. So there wasn't even a need to try and get additional information. There was enough, if not too much of it, out there in the public domain. And we sifted through that and we complemented it with industry reports, consulting firm analysis that were available again publicly, to identify those bits and pieces of data that would be really important for students' ability to then effectively apply the various frameworks. So it was the case of collecting the information and matching it or mapping it onto those different frameworks that we knew would be relatively convenient to illustrate with the case of Ryanair. So that was essentially the process. And I think if there was that opportunity to illustrate the varying frameworks and different approaches in strategy analysis of Ryanair, created a bit of a challenge as well, in that we actually had too much material, and we really had to work hard to cut the case to a manageable length and decide on maybe what we cannot really include in a single case like that. So even that modularity had to be restrained in that sense. We could probably write another case out of the material we still have on Ryanair with a different focus, with a slightly different angle. So it's a rich story that can be told about this company, and we had to pick and choose in that sense.
The one piece of advice that I got at the outset of the process, we have a colleague, Dr. Eleanor O'Higgins, who was, you might remember, Richard, a previous case winner for Ryanair as well.
Of course.
And Eleanor gave me a really great piece of advice, and that was start with the teaching node. Start with a very, very clear teaching objective, rather than starting with the case itself. And both Dorota and I were very familiar with Ryanair. We had been using Ryanair as an example in the classroom for years through, newspaper articles, vignettes, interview pieces. And so we had a good understanding of the issues. And we were able to kind of start almost with the teaching note before we had a rough outline of the teaching note before we even began writing the case itself. And I think that together with the modular approach served us quite well.
Well, it's a terrific case, and the modularity is very interesting, and I love the fact that it makes it a very flexible tool for other educators who've chosen it. Have you had any feedback from teachers who've adopted the case? Does it, for example, does the modularity, does that make it play better online? Is it a model you'd like to develop in writing cases that were perhaps more suited for online teaching?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Richard. And certainly the feedback that we've been getting from our colleagues who have been using the case has been pretty much consistent with that initial idea that we had, which is that instructors or facilitators can pick and choose the different elements, different sections of the case that suits them well. The other thing that we've heard from colleagues and also from our own experience is that this modularity enables us to maybe choose which aspects students can work on outside of classroom. So there could be elements that students are able to prepare as part of an assignment, pre-class assignment. And then you can use your 90 minutes class time with the students to focus on another aspect. So that is another useful idea here. We've heard from one of our colleagues as well that she used this case with an MBA class that's blocked and runs over a couple of days. And for her, the beauty of the Ryanair case study has been that she could use that single case to cover really a lot of different themes within strategy. And that works particularly well when you have a time condensed delivery of a module. So that's the feedback that we've been getting. Now, in terms of online delivery, as many of us, we had to switch to online delivery in the last 16 months or so as well. And I've actually used this case with my graduate strategy class last term, 140 students online for a single session. And I think that modularity really worked well in this as well, because what I was able to do was to prepare worksheets with specific questions that students were able to handle on their own. So even though the class size were so large and I couldn't physically visit or virtually visit all of the breakout rooms that were created, the students were able to work through modules with 2-3 questions on their own in their group breakout activities. And then we had really nice plenary discussions around their solutions, their ideas. So I think it does help in that way. And obviously the chunks need to be different. The pastures need to be cut differently when you work in an online environment as compared to face-to-face class. So that adjustment had to happen. It had worked well with this case, the way it has been designed, certainly for me. I'm not sure, Ciaran, what your experience has been.
Yeah, no, it has. I mean, I use it. I've used it both in undergraduate students and with MBA students, and it works really, really well. We use it, for example, for the business model canvas. And what's really great about it is you can send the students off and ask them to come up with the original business model. And what works really, really well is on Zoom is they can share their results with everybody. And likewise, we look at the next iteration and then the third iteration of the business model. So I think it's worked really, really well in an online setting. That being said, I think we're all pretty anxious to return to the physical classroom and have a blackboard again.
Well, I'm very anxious to return to a physical awards presentation setup as well. But in the meantime, I've really had a gas having this conversation with you today. Thank you very much indeed. You've been very generous in sharing your insights into how the case works and how it came to go to be put together. Thank you very much indeed. It just remains for me to congratulate you again on producing an outstanding case and on your winning of this award. Congratulations and thank you again.
Thank you, Richard. We really appreciate everything the Case Centre have done, and we really appreciate your support and this opportunity to discuss the case.
Thank you very much indeed. It has been a pleasure, and we hope this will continue motivating us in doing this type of work.